This is lecture 3, Macroeconomic Modelling. You will find this material in chapter 2 of Introduction to Macroeconomics by Paul Middleditch. In today's lecture, we will talk about the concept of modelling, the three agents and the three markets that we see in macroeconomics commonly. We will go through three baseline models, that's the circular flow, the Keynesian cross and the ASAD models, before talking about the economic schools of thought, the Keynesian and classical views. So what is an economic model? An economic model is really a representation of the economy that helps us to explain in a simple way to a non-economist how the economy works or how the economy will react to economic policy or an economic shock. It helps us to explain our proposed policies and to explain macroeconomic events to non-economists. We can present the economy in words, in mathematics, or in diagrams. There is no superior method or superior type of model. The words are just as good as maths or just as good as diagrams if it is effective. We can write models in terms of stock variables. That might be variables like unemployment at a particular point in time, or we can describe the economy through flow. So we have stock type models and flow type models. We have seen this diagram, which is the profile of economic growth in the UK on a quarterly basis. But is this diagram a model? It's something that we will discuss in the lecture at length, whether or not this can be thought of as a macroeconomic model. A macroeconomic model in particular will use assumptions, and one of those simplifying assumptions might be the use of a representative agent. For instance, the agent in the model might be the representative worker or the average worker. So there'll be one worker who represents an average worker interacting with other agents in our models, and they interact in markets. So for a worker, for a firm, they will interact in the labour market. A good model will provide us with some policy implications, so it will be able to predict, for instance, the use of an increase in government expenditure. A good model will also be able to affect the future effects on the economy from economic policy and economic shocks. And as with all models, they are most probably best kept simple. In that way, they are more useful as tools to explain the economy to non-economists. So the purpose of a model is not to be realistic as such, but to be useful for explaining the effects of economic policy and economic events. For a mathematical model, there are types of variables and types of equations. In terms of variables, there are exogenous or right-hand side variables and endogenous or left-hand side variables. The endogenous variables are the explained variable, and the exogenous variables are the variables that explain the endogenous variable. They sit on the right-hand side. There are three types of equations in a mathematical model. There are behavioral equations, which might explain the movement of an economic variable, such as consumption. There are identities, where we know something has to be true. And there are equilibrium conditions, which are the conditions that must be met to keep the model in equilibrium. We've mentioned the three markets and the three agents. Who are the three agents? Typically, the firm is the representative or average firm in the economy. The consumer is the representative consumer in the economy, normally representing the demand side. The policymaker is the monetary authority or the government, and they interact inside three main markets: the labour market, which is between workers and firms, the good market between consumers and firms, and the financial market, where the policymaker reacts with or interacts with both firms and consumers. This is a good time to reflect on some of the characteristics of macroeconomic models. They're not without criticism. Thomas Piketty in Capital in the 21st Century wrote, "In these representative agent models, which have become popular since the 60s, one assumes from the outset that the agents are the same, essentially, or they're average or representative agents. Such a simplification of reality may be justified for the study of certain very specific problems." But these very specific problems are macroeconomic problems. Problems that involve macroeconomic variables which are representative. So whilst Thomas provides some totally valid criticism, I would not say that it's totally damning at all. It's hardly damning. We'll now go on to introduce three key macroeconomic models. Even the most modern macroeconomic models have these as their baseline. Look at the circular flow, which is a flow type model, the Keynesian cross, which came from Keynes' general theory, and the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which we will do in detail for lecture 7. But we start with one of the most influential models, which is the circular flow. Influential because it is very simple and easy to understand, very good at explaining how money moves around the economy. We now focus on the circular flow model, which helps us to understand economic activity in society. We start with just two agents, so there's a simplifying assumption. Perhaps you might think that's not accurate, but nevertheless very simple. We can split agents into firms and households. Firms provide income or wages to households in return for labour effort, and households in return provide consumption or expenditure to firms. They provide firms with revenue which comes from their income. We see quite clearly here how money flows around the economy between firms and households. There is a very simple, easy to understand model that's very good at replicating a simple form of reality. We can, however, add some reality to the simplifications presented earlier. You might say, well, hang on a minute, what if somebody doesn't spend all their money on firms but saves some instead? So money is withdrawn from the circular flow. Types of withdrawals are savings into banks, into the financial sector, taxes into governments that use the money for societal reasons or societal expenditures, and there is money that could be withdrawn by consumers spending money on imports. The money is going to firms outside the economy. But in the same way that money can be withdrawn, it can be re-injected by the same agents. The financial sector might provide loans for firms, that be investment. Governments that receive taxes might spend that money into the economy in the form of government spending. And foreigners from abroad can also buy products from our firms in the way of export. So these are injections back into the flow. Let's now look at these complications in diagrammatic form. we understand the flow between firms and households. Firms provide income to households, and households provide domestic consumption back to firms. But households might save some of that money and put that money in the bank. The bank receives the money in the form of savings. Governments can receive money in the form of taxes, and the international trade sector can receive money, or foreigners can receive money in the form of revenues to firms through imports. But just as money is withdrawn, it can be re-injected. Banks can lend money to firms in the form of investment. Governments can spend money on the economy, provide firms with revenue that way, and foreigners can spend money on our domestic firms when they export to abroad. There we see a diagram that explains a more complicated version of the flow, or a 5-sector version of the circular flow of income. These are withdrawals, and these are the injections. Of course, now we see this relationship between injections and withdrawals. They are channeled through the additional 3 sectors: the finance sector, the public sector, and the international sector. Now imagine that the total amount of money being withdrawn is equal to the total amount of money being re-injected into the economy. We know that there will be no change in the speed of the flow. What is being drawn out is being pumped back in. So we can say that if the sum of all savings, taxes and imports, all the withdrawals, is equal to the sum of the injections, the investment, the government spending and exports, then the flow is in a state of equilibrium. Therefore have an equilibrium condition that specifies that savings, taxes and imports, S plus T plus M, must be equal to investment, government expenditure and exports. So that's in equilibrium. That becomes an equilibrium condition for our model. We now look at the Keynesian cross model, where the model suggests that the economy is driven by demand, or here planned expenditure. In other words, that consumers are deciding how much economic activity takes place. We'll start with a simplified Keynesian model. So we just have 2 sectors, in the same way that we started with 2 sectors in the circular flow. The central hypothesis is that firms will produce whatever households demand. There's no limit. The firms are passive and the consumers are active here. In other words, aggregate production, Y, is going to be determined by aggregate demand in the form of expenditure. So it's expenditure that will proxy for aggregate demand. And in equilibrium, what is being produced will be what is being demanded. So there is no need for firms to change production if they are meeting demand adequately. Given us any level of expenditure, what will the model predict for economic activity? And firms will choose this along the y-axis in our diagram in a moment. So let's look at this difference between expenditure and actual production to see how we get our market forces pushing us towards equilibrium. The firms do their best to meet demand, but if demand is going up and production isn't, then there is a difference. There is excess demand. The firms will then have to meet or increase production to meet that demand. And conversely, if there's a demand deficit, then firms will have to react to shelves not being emptied or being overstocked, so they'll have to produce less. Of course, when everything is exactly as planned or being demanded, we're in a state of equilibrium. And to model that equilibrium, we can do so in a 2-dimensional diagram where we are in a space between output and expenditure, which is, don't forget, is proxying for aggregate demand, and knowing that on a 45-degree line between those two variables, one must be equal to the other. That's our equilibrium condition. There is our two-dimensional diagram between expenditure, which is proxying for demand in the economy, and output, Y, which is also production. And when demand is equal to production, when we are in a state of equilibrium, those two are equal. We can represent this as the 45-degree line in our model. So for example, when demand is 100 billion in equilibrium, production will also be 100 billion. Anywhere along the E equals Y line, we are in equilibrium. Let's look more closely at this concept of aggregate demand, or what we've called planned expenditure. How can planned expenditure proxy for aggregate demand? Well, think of it this way. Is though we are thinking or planning to spend some money, we might be on the way to the shops. At this point, we are demanding goods. This is what it is, demand. When we actually spend this money, then the demand is turned into output or revenue for firms. It then becomes actual output. But in more detail on the expenditure function, we can write that AD, aggregate demand, is equal to expenditure. So we have planned expenditure proxying for aggregate demand. And we know that expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G. It's the components. We can split expenditure between consumers, firms and households in the form of investment, and governments, so that we have that AD, aggregate demand, is equal to planned expenditure, which we can write as C plus I plus G. So let's graph the planned expenditure function in EY space, in planned expenditure output space. We can draw the aggregate demand or the expenditure function as upward sloping in Y. Upward sloping, which is represented at a higher income, we have higher expenditure through the consumption function. Consumption will be higher as income rises, and so expenditure has to be higher as income rises. Notice also that there is an intercept on the expenditure function which represents autonomous expenditure, which might be the expenditure that we would make even if our income was zero. We bring the Keynesian cross together by combining the equilibrium condition with the expenditure function. When we impose the expenditure function onto the 45-degree line, the model gives us a prediction of equilibrium income, at which point output, production, firms are producing, is exactly equal to demand. The blue line is in the same place as the red line. We now go on to introduce the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. It's a two-agent model in prices output space, a two-dimensional analysis between prices and output. The demand side in the model is represented by the aggregate demand curve, which in itself is a representation of the average consumer. It shows a negative relationship between price and planned expenditure. A change in either price or output is shown by a movement along the AD curve, but a change in anything else that's outside the model, any exogenous change, is shown by a shift in the aggregate demand curve. There is our two-dimensional space, price level and output. And the aggregate demand curve is shown as downward sloping, which is showing that higher prices are associated with lower output. Why is that? Well, at higher prices we'll have lower exports. Higher prices we will have less spending. And at higher prices we'll have the interest of the central bank, who are likely to raise interest rates to control inflation. So we see that at higher price levels there is less output demanded in the economy, but as the price level falls, the amount of output demanded is greater. Now, the supply side of the economy is represented by the aggregate supply curve, which in itself is a representation of the average firm in the economy. It represents all firms. It predicts a positive relationship between price and production. At higher prices, more firms will come into the market and produce more. This is the intuition. A change in the price or output in our two-dimensional analysis would be shown as a movement along the AS curve. Any other exogenous change outside the model that affects firms, will be shown as a shift in the aggregate supply curve. Now we can show this in a two-dimensional diagram between prices and output, that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. As prices increase of goods, more suppliers are likely to come to the market and produce. That's why at higher prices firms are happy to produce more. Now normally we predict an upward sloping AS curve, but actually we can split them into two, into a long run aggregate supply curve and a short run aggregate supply curve. Two time frames to one representing the aggregate supply side, and we'll see that in a slide or two. Together, the aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve predict an equilibrium, a general equilibrium between prices and national output, where the two curves cross. Now imagine a scenario where the price is below that of the equilibrium price. At P2, with the red dotted line here, we can see that aggregate demand, P2, is greater than aggregate supply. So we have excess demand in the economy. People are demanding goods, but there are not enough goods in the marketplace. So we'll see natural forces, the prices will increase in such a scenario and move us back towards the equilibrium price. These natural forces, and here excess demand is the distance A minus B, will push us back to equilibrium. At the equilibrium price, there are no more forces pushing the economy, and so the price will remain the same. Now move on to economic policy. Two main types of policy that we use in macroeconomics are fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is where the government changes its expenditure or spending or taxation with a view to manipulating the level of demand in the economy with a view to changing output or having some effect on the direction of the business cycle. For monetary policy, the central bank can change the amount of money in the economy with the same aim to manipulating aggregate demand, something that we call demand management, fiscal and monetary policy. You see this in a handy table. Here we have policy type. This is fiscal policy. These are changes to government expenditure and taxation. So we are using the variables G and T. And the transmission is via aggregate demand. So an increase in G will lead us to an increase in aggregate demand. There will be more expenditure in the economy. And if there is more expenditure or planned expenditure, this will lead to higher output. An increase in G will increase aggregate demand, but an increase in T will lower aggregate demand. Higher taxes lowers demand in the economy. For monetary policy, the central bank changes the money supply, it uses the variable M. It Again, this is via aggregate demand. That's why it's called demand management. A change in the money supply, for instance, an increase, will increase the amount of planned expenditure, and that will lead to higher output, hopefully. We now go on to look at the differing economic schools of thought, the opinions, the divide in economics between those that believe that prices are flexible and those that believe prices are sticky. So we're delineating by intervention. Two main views, the Keynesian and classical view. The Keynesian school believes that the economy is driven by consumers, in other words, aggregate demand. So output is endogenous, it depends on demand in this way. Therefore, there is obviously a place for economic policy. We say that policy will be effective. The classical view is opposite to this. Output is fixed in the long run and prices increase. So changes in aggregate demand only lead to increases in inflation. We have expansionary policy, this just leads to inflation, and no change in economic activity. So policy is said to be ineffective or futile. Here we can see in diagrams the two different schools of thought. So we see that Keynesians that believe in intervention with an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, an increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD dash will give us an increase in output and an increase in prices. However, the classical school that believes that the output is fixed in the long run, so the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, an increase in aggregate demand from AD to AD dash will give us an increase in prices, but no increase in output. So these are the differing opinions amongst economists. And both schools represent the extremes. The Keynesian view is essentially proposing that prices are fixed in the short run, and the classical view that output is fixed in the long run. But let's look at reality. Imagine a helicopter drop of money on an economy. What would we expect to see? And we will discuss this in the lecture. Initially, the new money will increase activity, but then as firms get busier, they start to put their prices up, and we start to see inflation. If there is inflation, then output's going to decrease back again. So new money brings activity, but also inflation shortly afterwards. So both schools are correct, just not on their own. There is the neo-synthesis consensus.